Hi, welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about Chapter 20, Federalism. I believe this is Lecture 7, and this is by Jonathan Rodden. Oh, excuse me. So we're going to talk about the effects of federalism, um, sort of where it's going historically, um, and its sort of philosophical underpinnings. Okay, so part one is basically just a sort of review of the historical classical literature, right? So historically, from sort of the 17th century, or excuse me, 18th century on, um, some French and English philosophers, especially, suggested that sort of small is better, right? So you have Montesquieu and Rousseau, who both argue that smaller governments are more attuned to their people, but they also sort of recognize that a large state is can be beneficial, right? For numerous reasons, and especially because of the sort of the state defense, right? The ability to sort of raise a large military and protect yourself. So they suggest there should be sort of a two-layered tier system, right? Government on the ground at the local level, and then government at the national level to provide military support. And then we move to Alexander Hamilton, who, as we know, was a Federalist, and so he was a proponent of larger government. He suggests that there are big benefits to be had from a bigger state, right? Such as tax collection. We know that the bigger state is, the more efficient they are in tax collection. In sharing a currency, right, which reduces some of the sort of the difficulties in trade, and then economies of scale, right? We know when it comes to production, the larger societies have much bigger economies of scale. But then on the other side, you have Jefferson, right, from the Anti-Federalists, who is very concerned with the federal government sort of taking states' rights, right? And then from sort of an ethnic conflict perspective, federalism is thought to help reduce ethnic conflict. Um, so this is why, um, the idea here is that you're sort of redistributing power to the local level, the regional level, and so some ethnic and tribal groups in particular sort of minority geographies would have more say over their governance and therefore be less likely to sort of rebel against the overall state. So this was, the main reason for instituting federalism in India, and Brazil and Belgium, which is highly ethnically divided, and then even more recently with sort of the construction of the Iraqi constitution post 9/11. Um, they set up a federal system because of the sort of Shia Sunni Kurd issue in their nation. Okay, so we'll move on to part two. Benevolent despots, local competition, and leviathans. And there are some economic theories about federalism that are sort of presented in this part. Um, the first idea is that sort of benevolent despots and politicians would devolve power to the locals, who would be better informed and better functioning, and this would therefore boost the economy, right? So this is sort of the old school theoretical idea, um, that politicians would have an incentive to actually devolve power, um, so that the locals would have more control over their own sort of economic laws. And this should create sort of local economic efficiency, which should boost the economy, right? Then there's a sort of a different perspective. It's competitive federalism. So this is like the United States idea, right, where each state is competing against the others to not only attract citizens and tax base, but also to attract businesses, right? And so this is a big Texas strategy, is to keep the tax base very low, to try and convince citizens from other states to move here, and also to convince companies to move here. So, we've seen Toyota move in, we've seen most of Elon Musk's companies move in, we've seen a lot of shifts from sort of the Silicon Valley and San Francisco towards Austin, Texas. So this is that sort of competitive federalism idea. And then you have the sort of Leviathan philosophy, and this is the idea that a central state, a unitary state, would be incentivized to just overtax everyone. And so federalism helps to offer competition when decentralized and ensure that the citizens aren't overtaxed. Okay, so we'll move on to part 3, where we move into political economy. And we want to sort of rethink these institutions. And so we move into the more of the research paradigm. And first we show that statistics have shown a lot of problems with the former theories, right? So yes, those former theories are sort of utopian, but when we actually dig into the statistics and the data, we find that federalism actually leads to subnational debt accumulation, especially in those countries where they don't allow the federal levels to tax, and only the sort of federal government can tax, the overarching government. We see more corruption at the local level when there's federalism. And we also see more sort of macroeconomic distress. You're more likely to have sort of recessions and depressions and things of that sort. Okay, so we'll move on to section 3.1, where we talk about representation, right? And so he talks about welfare, and he says that studies show that grants to federal units are often just bribes to build coalitions, right? So if you think about sort of a PR system where they have to build a coalition government after the election, a lot of times what we'll find is that the central government will send money to the federal governments to try and shore up their coalition building, right? We'll basically provide you a payoff if you'll promise to join our government, right? And we also find that redistribution decisions are very different when the system changes from sort of federal to unitary, where federal redistribution is often sort of focused on locals, whereas, and it can be very narrow, whereas sort of unitary redistribution, when there's only a national government, tends to be far more widespread among the greater population. Let's see. Oh, a very interesting point here on the status quo. They make the point, and they point out some good research that suggests that sometimes when there's federalism involved, a small minority can sort of dictate policies and undermine any reforms because of the super majority rule, right? These states have very much power in legislatures like the Senate, right, where small states have a lot more power. And they can basically block reforms. And so the suggestion is that this is what happened in the South during slavery and Jim Crow periods, where the South blocked any real reform to the system, even though abolitionism was the majority opinion. Okay, let's see. Part 3.2, intergovernmental fiscal structures. It was interesting. They find the statistics sort of bear out that subnational governments that fund themselves tend to be the most economically viable, right? So we talked about this a little bit a minute ago. When the national government allows the subnational governments to sort of raise their own operating funds through taxation, like local property taxes or income tax, etc., they tend to be much more economically viable. Whereas in states where the central government is basically paying the bills of the federal governments, those federal governments tend to be much more corrupt, and they tend to run their governments very poorly, at least from a sort of economic perspective, right? They're much more likely to get into trouble. They're much more likely to have to declare bankruptcy. And the sort of central state is much more likely to have to bail them out, right? Okay, we'll move on to part 4, endogenous institutions. So again, remember, endogenous means that it can sort of change from the inside rather than thinking of an institution as sort of monolithic or unchanging. So why do some federations overpower small states is the question here. The idea here is that small states or states with ethnic or linguistic minorities will often only really sign on if they get widespread protections and rights, right? So this is why we see so many disproportionately defined senates or upper houses in many of these democratic countries, is because the sort of smaller, weaker states will refuse to comply unless you give them sort of promises that they get these sort of widespread protections and rights, right? And we also find that the wealthy elite in society tend to favor an upper chamber, right, over a highly equal chamber like the House of Representatives. They would much rather have a highly unequal chamber like the Senate because it allows them to sort of provide a buffer against the urban areas where labor is, right? We know that the urban areas all tend to be much more democratic. You tend to have much poorer people. And they, of course, are going to want redistribution, right? Whereas the wealthy don't want redistribution. And so this upper chamber is a way for them to ensure that the sort of urban areas don't go wild with their sort of tax redistribution plans, because they have a lot of power in the House, right? But they don't have a lot of power in the Senate. So this gives them a way to balance it. Okay. Part 4.2 focuses on intergovernmental fiscal arrangements. So how does the distribution of wealth between the states work? There's a really famous guy named Wash in 2003, who basically says that decentralizing the tax decisions is a technique for keeping the union together when some states are wealthier than others, right? So we have like New York, which is a very wealthy state, versus Mississippi, right, which is a very poor state. And so decentralizing the tax decisions and letting the local officials determine their own tax base is a way to sort of keep the union together, even though some states are much wealthier than others. And it's a way to ensure that there won't be sort of large scale wealth redistribution across the states. Okay, the second question is, how are decisions about federal construction decided? And O'Neill in 2003, who does a study on Latin America, basically says that it's not about voter preferences, right? Voter preferences have very little influence on the way that a constitution actually turns out. And instead, what he says is that when they're determining whether they're going to have a federal or a unitary system, the politicians at the national level will be much more likely to institute a sort of a federal system at the local level, when their regional or sort of their national electoral likelihood looks poor, but they're able to win an election on the regional level, right? So if you're very concerned that you don't have sort of a national profile, but you want to stay in politics, you'll institute federalism so that you can keep your seat at least at the sort of regional or local level. And this is often because you've passed out patronage, right, to the people in your local level, so they'll keep you in your seat. All right, well, that's all I've got for you today. I hope you enjoyed it. I thought federalism was really important, and we'll probably talk about it a little more later when we talk about ethnic conflict. So y'all have a great day, and I'll see you for the next one.